All right, click the links to join the channel here, become a member over at Subscribestar. Thanks to everyone who has support over there, Vegan and Ireland, everyone else. So be sure to join the Rumble and the Odyssey. Rumble is freaking awesome. I'm gonna love it, until I don't know if I'll be showing the door for being politically incorrect over there because I'm seeing a lot of problematic content on Rumble. But it goes through the App Store. So as soon as somebody wants to raise an issue, all they have to do is complain to Google and Apple, and all it takes is like it was like Bernstein writing articles about SOF. All it takes is somebody in the mainstream to start to do an expose on the dangerous alt-right content on Rumble. You look around, you're like, oh, so you guys just want to control the narrative completely and totally. Yeah, pretty much. They keep clipping away at the end of the spectrum as they kicked him off of YouTube. And I don't know if they're going to kick him off Rumble. From what I've heard about the interviews with the Rumble guy, he seems pretty well dedicated to free speech, and so does Kaufman at Odyssey, but Odyssey's not going through the app stores. So anyway, Mike Barron is raising a legal war chest to sue Daily Kos for defamation and tortious interference, I assume, regarding his graphic novels on Kickstarter. So what happened is, it's all this stuff is really kind of sad to see because it only happens in a low trust commercial zone country, which like America has turned into. It's not the country it used to be. So Barron's trying to sell his comics on Kickstarter, and the Daily is organized a mass flagging campaign using the website to initiate a campaign to get their audience to mass report the comic. Except, of course, they've never read the comic. It's still in the funding stage. No one has read the comic. It started after the Daily had published an article by Star Mignon that called the comic Istophobic, and as for the name of Star, I assume was a pen name, during a discovery that will be made public. They claimed that Barron's comic book was somehow istophobic, but I guess, they were using ESP because nobody has read it. It writes about Middle Eastern, Asian, and Mexican people in the comic, and he demonizes them. And the thing is, during the discovery process, when you find out who the editor, who everyone involved at the Daily Kos is, and who all these letter writers are, and you start looking at them, you're gonna find a lot of mentally ill people who like they live their whole life on Twitter, and there's probably a lot of teenagers on there. They say his comic is stochastic terrorism disguised as a comic book, or sometimes the pipe is just a pipe. It could just be a comic book. But the bigger perspective is that to the globalist worldview, the only people who can play the role of the antagonists end up being blonde-haired, blue-eyed men. You see this way off more often in comics than you do in movies because the cost is less. But one great example is the whole Immortal Hulk series. But if you want to look at two issues, issue 1, Immortal Hulk, and issue 11, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's like, Joe, another green and blue-eyed motorcycle gang committing a ton of crime in the inner city. Gee, Al Ewing, that's kind of. I think he's in England, right? And you go like, so do you think that's what American cities are like? These blonde hair, blue eyed, and red hair, green eyed motorcycle gangs are actually running Americans' inner city. That first issue, Al Ewing was a 50 run. It went. It was a lecture on the Second Amendment from this guy in England who thinks that these fair skinned people are just the scourge of American cities. I don't know what to say. That's life in clown world. Anyway, so any other antagonist other than the blue and green eyed people is going to be called wrongthink, and it's going to get a soy Twitter mob to get you deplatformed. And these people live on social media, and they look like it too. They're, greasy and a little bit overweight. This is how they control the narrative, and from a commercial perspective, eventually it whitewashes the antagonists and brownwashes the protagonists. So when you look at the cover, all you have to do is simply see two different skin tones presented. It's how much ink they use in the process, and that tells you the whole friggin' story. It's like, what about the willing suspension of disbelief? Like, oh, what are you talking about? Well, the correlation between fair and dark characters on a comic book, it's pretty much 100%. Oh, well, we're just redressing past grievances. That doesn't make sense. The way to redress past grievances isn't to seek revenge against the people who didn't do it. It's to treat people fairly now. It's like, oh, we're not going to do that because this is cultural Marxism. Like, well, how well is that stuff selling? Not too well. Anyway, so then they encourage people to contact Kickstarter and get the comic kicked off, which is where the tortious interference argument is going to come in. They were encouraging people who had never read the story to report the story based on Starr's statements. So Kickstarter, who had approved the comic, changed their mind based on people reporting it who had never read the comic, and that was all it took. They canceled the comic. Kickstarter said something, they sent them a letter, said something, keep in mind, it's like, this is their job, writing comics, and this is the marketplace that they use to sell those comics, to get them into people who want to read these comics. Obviously, there's no reason to cancel these comics. But, that's on Kickstarter. It's like, oh, we really got to find a pathway around Kickstarter. Well, more on that in a second. So Kickstarter says something about, offensive content, inclusivity, intolerance, bigotry. Obviously, they're not going to go into details because all this stuff is going to have to come out in court. But when you start to ask them, like, what does that look like in the real world in terms of crowdfunded comics? In the real world, it means what I had just said, that every antagonist has to be blue or green-eyed. You have to have, it's got to be that every bad guy is going to, every bad guy is going to have to be of European origin. Like Mike Miller did a Lone Star comic, and it was about gang activity, and they wouldn't allow it because he was talking about what actually goes on. And they said, oh, that's marginalized and oppressed. You're talking about like felonious gangsters are marginalized and oppressed? Yes, if they have brown skin. That's insane, but it's a private platform, and you kind of think, oh, wait, how come our representatives don't do anything to prevent discrimination against people who are trying to sell a product? I mean, if you have an open marketplace, why are you able to discriminate against people based on their political opinions? Why isn't social media a guaranteed free speech site? Why can banks and these NGOs, these billion-dollar companies, why can they just discriminate against the individual? It's like, shouldn't free speech is so valuable that I value individual liberty over a billion-dollar corporation. Who wouldn't? It's like, why don't our representatives do something about that? Because the puppet masters that control our representatives don't want them to do anything about that. So that's the situation. So what happens is every bad guy is going to have to be blonde or red hair, or obviously just the lighter, the more fair of the skin. Which so again, that's the story is like it's the conclusion is given as soon as I see the two characters juxtaposed. I know that the one who's more fair is going to be the bad guy, because it's every single time they're the bad guy. And if I see a close-up of blue or green eyes, I know you're telegraphing to me that, oh, this is somehow the nefarious character. And I mean, I literally remember that from Al Ewing's Immortal Hulk #1, where they zoom in on the guy, blonde hair, green eyes. At least they switched it up a little bit there. And he goes in there and he commits 3 Malum and Say acts against the person, departing them from this mortal coil. And then he goes back to his white motorcycle gang, where they proceed to get a lecture on the Second Amendment from the Immortal Hulk. It's just as cringe as it sounds. Anyway, so they define everyone who is not a European male as a marginalized group. So they can never be the antagonist in your story, which makes for a really boring story. And if you scroll through Kickstarter, Indiegogo's, and realistically, Indiegogo and Kickstarter are just the same. That's why there are a few people who are starting up some crowdfunding campaigns now, but really the big dogs in Comicsgate have got to get behind them. And the biggest big dogs is going to be Eric July and Ethan Van Sciver. And whatever direction they go in is kind of up to them. If they're pushing an independent crowdfunding campaign, the two of them put together are big enough to make something work, because everyone in Comicsgate will just jump on board with them, and even people who are kind of around Comicsgate will jump on board with them. So all that kind of stuff is up to those the big dogs. Now, in most cases, all this kind of stuff most of the time is going to fly under the radar. But all it takes is a mob on social media to come after you, and suddenly you're out of business. And most of the time, these people are anonymously destroying your life unless you sue, and you get the logs during the discovery process, and it shows you who these people are, and you can seek peaceful and constitutionally protected redress of grievance. Don't say anything. It's pretty much the future of low trust America, which is why it's so important to create the parallel economy and simply create our own crowdfunding, sites, websites, networks, whatever we have to do, because this stuff is really held in the hands of the left. It's not just the crowdfunding campaigns, but it's the financial services campaigns. They can, if Mike Barron say he's on, all these kind of other financial services, they can mass report those accounts too. It's like, it doesn't have to be based on anything. They'll just take your account down. I will say in that regard, there are alts that are sprung up, like GiveSendGo, Subscribestar, um, are are better sites, and there's a couple others that use. But those go directly to your bank, and then some use Stripe. It's a complicated situation, but I mean, if you're big enough, then they'll just go to your bank. Like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase Bank have debanked people for their political views. They're peaceful, constitutionally protected political views, both in America and Europe. And it's like, again, why aren't our representatives doing anything about this? Because they're taking your taxpayer money, and some of it's going to Ukraine, and a lot of it's going back in their pocket. When Nancy Pelosi isn't selling her Google stocks before a major decision about Google. I mean, seriously, you can search that on the internet. Nancy Pelosi Google stock sale. It's all this stuff actually is all happening out in the public. It's kind of the destruction of a country, shifting from what was a high trust in the 50s to a medium trust to a low trust, very tribal nation. There was a nation, is now it's just an economic zone where our elected representatives, the constitutional representative republic, don't actually represent us because these NGOs have more power than individual voters. And you see like, oh, so Facebook and Twitter and Google actually kind of control elections, because if people campaign for elections, like in 2016 when people got Trump elected, it's like a lot of that happened on YouTube. So what happened after 2016 is YouTube kicked off about 10,000 channels that were on the right that were helping to move the window to the right. Google just kicked off all those channels. Like, that doesn't seem like that should be legal, because that is affecting the constitutional process. Yeah, again, I'm waiting. Don't hold your breath waiting for the 535 representatives to do something about any of this kind of stuff. Until they do, or until we're able to pressure them legally to do that, you got to form the parallel economy. You got to, do something. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe. Thanks again to you, Vegan in Ireland, and everyone else who has been on Subscribestar, making some stuff happen over there, which you'll see the result of in about a week. And I will see you guys all next episode.